My name is Megan Harper. I was 36 years old when I stood in the middle of my own wedding reception and realized my husband had helped humiliate my parents in front of everyone I loved. I noticed it before dinner. My mother was sitting near the service doors. My father was beside her, not at the family table, not even close. They had been placed at a small table near the back corridor where waiters pushed carts in and out of the kitchen. Meanwhile, the long table beside my husband Daniel was filled with his mother, his two sisters, their husbands, his uncle, his aunt, and 3 cousins I had met maybe twice. 9 Harpers, 0 members of my family. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Then I saw my mother's face. She already knew. I crossed the ballroom, still holding the champagne glass someone had pressed into my hand, and found Daniel near the hallway. I asked him who changed the seating chart. He would not look at me. Then his mother appeared. She told me my parents should be grateful they had been invited at all. I actually laughed. One short laugh. Because the alternative was screaming. Daniel caught my wrist and whispered that I needed to calm down because there were 200 people watching us. That was when I heard his uncle speaking behind the half-open office door. He mentioned my father, then money, then a document Daniel had apparently signed 3 weeks before our wedding. My hand went cold. Daniel immediately stepped toward the door. Too late. I had heard enough to understand that the seating arrangement was not the real betrayal. My parents had been pushed into that corner for a reason. And somehow, my father had known something about Daniel before I walked down the aisle. Before I tell you what happened next, if you're enjoying this story so far, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and turn on notifications. It truly helps this channel reach more people who love emotional family stories like these. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in her place? I'm curious to read your thoughts. Then I looked across the ballroom. My father was no longer sitting down. He was standing beside his chair with an old brown envelope in his hand. The same envelope I had seen him hide inside his jacket before the ceremony. Our eyes met. He shook his head once. A warning. Do not do this here. But something inside me had already changed. I walked past Daniel, past his mother, past the wedding coordinator trying to stop me. The band had just finished a song when I climbed onto the small stage and reached for the microphone. 200 conversations faded. Daniel called my name. I looked at my parents sitting beside the kitchen doors. Then I looked at the family occupying the seats that had been stolen from them. And before I could say a single word, Daniel rushed toward the stage and whispered something that made me realize the man I had married that morning had been keeping a secret from me for almost a year. Daniel and I had been together for 4 years before we married. When we met, I was working as an operations manager for a regional medical supply company outside Columbus, Ohio. It was not glamorous work, but I liked knowing exactly where things stood. Purchase orders either matched or they did not. Deliveries arrived or someone had to explain why. Daniel was different. He worked in commercial real estate with his older uncle, Richard Harper, and seemed comfortable in rooms where everyone else was trying to impress someone. He remembered waiters' names. He called his grandmother every Sunday. When my car battery died during our 3rd month together, he drove 40 minutes before work to help me. For a long time, I believed kindness was simply part of him. Our families could not have been more different. My parents, Robert and Linda Bennett, had spent most of their marriage running a small flooring and renovation company. Dad still kept invoices in paper folders because he trusted filing cabinets more than clouds. Mom handled payroll and could remember the price of every refrigerator she had purchased since 1998. They were comfortable, but nobody would call them wealthy. The Harpers were. Daniel's mother, Patricia, lived in a house with rooms nobody seemed to use. She talked about country clubs, investment properties, and people by their last names as though everyone should know who they were. She was polite to my parents, always polite. That almost made it worse. At our engagement dinner, Patricia asked Dad whether he still installed floors himself. Dad smiled and said sometimes. Patricia tilted her head. At your age. Mom immediately touched his arm under the table. That was how my family handled insults. We absorbed them. Daniel apologized afterward. He said his mother could be difficult. I accepted that explanation because Daniel always seemed embarrassed by her behavior. At least then, the wedding changed things. Patricia offered to pay for the reception venue. My parents offered us $30,000 toward whatever we needed. Daniel suggested we use my parents' money for the down payment on a house instead. It sounded practical. Dad agreed, but he insisted the money remain in an account under my name until we found a property. Daniel did not argue, not openly. 2 months later, he began bringing me listings connected to Harper Commercial. Each one was larger than we needed. Each one required more cash. When Dad looked at the numbers, he told us to wait. Daniel smiled through dinner. In the car afterward, he gripped the steering wheel. "Your father treats me like I cannot provide for you." I told him Dad treated everyone like that when money was involved. Daniel said nothing. A week later, Patricia began talking about wedding expenses. The flowers were suddenly too simple. The photographer was not experienced enough. The guest list needed another 40 people because certain Harper business relationships had to be respected. Every change somehow benefited Daniel's family. Every objection somehow became mine. I started giving in because I was tired. That was my mistake. Not trusting Daniel. Giving up small decisions because I told myself they were not worth fighting over. My mother noticed. 3 weeks before the wedding, she came to my apartment with coffee and asked whether I was happy. Of course I am. She watched me for several seconds. That is not what I asked. I remember being irritated. I had seating charts open on my laptop. Patricia had sent 12 messages before 9 that morning. Daniel was meeting Richard about a property deal. I told Mom everyone was stressing me out. She nodded. Then she asked something strange. "Has Daniel ever asked you to sign anything related to your father's company?" I stared at her. "No. Why?" She said Dad had received an inquiry about selling the warehouse his company operated from. That warehouse mattered. My grandfather had bought it decades earlier. Dad eventually inherited it and renovated half of it himself. The neighborhood had changed since then, and developers had been buying industrial properties around it. Dad had refused every offer. Who contacted him? Mom hesitated. Harper Commercial. My stomach tightened. Daniel had never mentioned it. That evening I confronted him. He looked genuinely surprised. He said Richard handled acquisitions and probably did not even realize the property belonged to my father. I wanted to believe him, so I did. 2 days later, Daniel brought flowers to my parents' house and apologized personally. Dad accepted, but something between them had shifted. At our rehearsal dinner, Dad barely spoke to Daniel. Then came the seating chart. I had personally placed my parents beside us. Patricia had complained that her sister's family deserved prominent seats. I refused. For once, firmly, my parents stay beside me. Daniel kissed my forehead. Absolutely. On the morning of the wedding, everything seemed normal. Dad walked me down the aisle. His hand trembled once before the doors opened. I thought he was emotional. Now I know better. After the ceremony, while photographs were being taken, Patricia asked the coordinator for 10 minutes alone. Daniel disappeared with her. When I asked where he had gone, his sister said there was a problem with dinner service. There was no problem with dinner service. They were changing the seating plan. By the time I entered the reception, my parents' names had been removed from the head table entirely. And Daniel had known. Back on that stage, microphone in my hand, I watched him approaching me. "Megan, please." I lowered the microphone. "Tell me what you signed." His face changed. That tiny hesitation answered more than words could. Richard reached us next. He told Daniel to get me away from the microphone. Then Dad appeared below the stage. He still held the brown envelope. Patricia looked at him and went pale. That was when I understood something else. She knew what was inside. Dad climbed one step toward me. I asked him why Harper Commercial wanted his warehouse. He looked at Daniel, then at me. "Because they do not want the warehouse, sweetheart." The room seemed to disappear around us. Dad opened the envelope. Inside was a copy of a purchase agreement. At the bottom of the final page was Daniel's signature. Dad handed it to me. I read the property description twice. The warehouse was only one parcel. The agreement covered 3 adjoining lots as well, including land I had inherited from my grandfather 8 years earlier. Land I had never agreed to sell, and according to the document in my hands, Daniel had already promised a buyer that I would. I did not understand the document immediately. That mattered later. People like Richard Harper depended on other people being too embarrassed to admit they did not understand something. The agreement was 17 pages long. The first pages described a redevelopment project involving several connected parcels near my father's warehouse. Harper Commercial was listed as the acquisition partner. The proposed buyer was a development company called Northgate Urban Partners. The total deal was worth millions. My inherited land was the missing piece. Without it, the developer could still buy the surrounding properties, but the planned access road could not be built where they wanted it. The project would become more expensive and might not happen at all. I looked at Daniel. How could you promise them my property? He shook his head quickly. I did not sell anything. Dad stepped closer. No, you promised them you could deliver it. That distinction was important. Daniel had not forged my signature. He had not legally transferred my property. Instead, the agreement stated that Harper Commercial would obtain control of the remaining parcels before closing. My parcel was specifically identified. Daniel had signed as project manager. Richard finally spoke. This is a business document. It has nothing to do with the wedding. Dad gave him a look I had rarely seen. Then why did your family spend 3 weeks trying to convince me not to show it to my daughter? Silence. Real silence. Even the servers had stopped moving. Patricia approached us and told me there had been a misunderstanding. I almost believed her tone. That was Patricia's talent. She could make betrayal sound like poor communication. I asked Dad where he got the agreement. He explained that Harper Commercial had approached him months earlier through a separate brokerage company. Dad rejected the first offer. Then came a second, then a third, each higher. He became suspicious because the buyer seemed unusually interested in closing before summer. So he asked his attorney, Marcus Reed, to investigate. Marcus found a public planning application connected to Northgate. That application showed the proposed access route, straight across my land. Dad had confronted Daniel 10 days before the wedding. I turned toward Daniel. 10 days. You knew for 10 days that Dad had this. Daniel rubbed his forehead. I was going to tell you after the wedding. After. The word landed harder than I expected. Dad corrected him. He knew much longer than 10 days. Then he removed another sheet from the envelope. It was an email. Daniel had sent it to Richard 11 months earlier. My eyes moved down the printed page. Megan will eventually agree. Her father is the bigger obstacle. I stopped reading. 11 months. Before our engagement, before the venue, before Patricia started treating my parents like an inconvenience that needed managing. My mind began rearranging memories. Daniel asking casually whether Dad planned to retire. Daniel wanting to know whether my grandfather had left other property. Richard joking at Thanksgiving that land was useless unless you knew when to sell it. Patricia encouraging us to buy a house before the wedding. The $30,000, my account, my inheritance. Separate pieces suddenly belonged to the same picture. I asked Daniel when he first learned Northgate wanted my land. He did not answer. Richard did. Before you two were engaged. Daniel turned sharply toward him. Richard shrugged. The loyalty between them was already collapsing. I climbed down from the stage. I needed distance. Daniel followed. Megan, listen to me. I turned. Did you propose because of that property? His face tightened. No, too fast. I knew Daniel well enough to recognize when he was choosing words instead of telling the truth. He reached for my hand. I moved it away. He said the deal appeared months after we started dating. Richard discovered my family owned the parcels during a title search. Daniel insisted he loved me before any of it mattered. That might even have been true, and somehow that made everything worse, because betrayal did not require our entire relationship to be fake. It only required him to decide that loving me gave him permission to use me. Then my mother came forward. She looked embarrassed. Not for herself. For me. There is something else. Dad closed his eyes. Linda. She ignored him. 3 days ago, Patricia called us. Patricia immediately denied it. Mom continued. She asked us not to attend the reception. My chest tightened. Patricia had offered to arrange a private dinner for my parents after the honeymoon. She said tension over the property could embarrass me, and that it would be better if they quietly left after the ceremony. Dad refused. Then Patricia warned him that exposing the business dispute at my wedding could damage my marriage. That explained the table. They could not remove my parents, so they humiliated them instead. Put them somewhere invisible, make them uncomfortable enough to leave. I looked toward the back of the ballroom. The little table beside the service doors suddenly seemed less childish. It had been pressure, calculated pressure. Daniel said he had not known Patricia called them. I believed him. For about 5 seconds. Then Dad handed me one final page. A screenshot of a message Daniel had sent Patricia that morning. Just keep Robert away from Megan until tomorrow. I will handle everything after we leave. My stomach dropped. He had known Dad might tell me. The seating arrangement had not been about status. It had been about control. Keep my father away. Keep me smiling, get through the reception, leave for our honeymoon. Then deal with the consequences when I was already married and emotionally trapped inside the decision. Daniel stared at the screenshot. His shoulders lowered. For the first time that day, he stopped defending himself. I asked him one question. What exactly were you planning to ask me to sign after the wedding? He looked toward Richard. That was answer enough. But Richard made another mistake. He said it was only an authorization related to preliminary development discussions. Only. I almost laughed again. Instead, I asked Dad whether the agreement could force me to sell. No. Daniel finally looked relieved. Dad continued. But if Harper Commercial cannot secure your parcel by the deadline, they lose their acquisition fee and may owe Northgate damages under the contract. Richard's expression changed. There it was, the real fear. Not embarrassment. Money. A lot of it. Daniel had gambled on my cooperation. Richard had gambled on Daniel controlling me. Patricia had gambled on my parents staying quiet to protect my wedding day. And I had spent months helping all three of them believe I would always choose peace over confrontation. I looked at the microphone still lying on the stage, then at 200 guests waiting to see whether the bride would cry, leave, forgive, or pretend nothing had happened. I had no idea whether my marriage would survive the next 10 minutes, but I knew one thing. I was not signing anything. Not tomorrow. Not next month. Not because Daniel apologized. Not because Patricia cried. Not because Richard threatened lawsuits. What would you have done in my place? Would you have taken Daniel somewhere private and tried to save the marriage? Or would you have exposed everything in front of the people they had worked so hard to impress? I thought I knew my answer. Then Dad touched my arm. There is one more thing you need to see before you decide what to do. He reached into the envelope again. This time he pulled out a bank record. I recognized the account number immediately. It was the account holding the $30,000 my parents had given me. The balance should have been untouched. It was not. $25,000 had been transferred out 6 weeks earlier, and the recipient listed on the statement was Harper Commercial. For several seconds, I thought Dad had handed me the wrong statement. The account was mine. The transfer was real, but I had never authorized it. I looked at Daniel. How did $25,000 leave my account? He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Then I remembered. 6 weeks earlier, Daniel had brought a stack of wedding paperwork home, vendor confirmations, insurance forms, a revised catering agreement. He had placed little yellow tabs beside every signature line because I was leaving early the next morning for a 3-day work conference. I signed them at our kitchen counter, quickly, carelessly. One of those pages had been a bank authorization. Daniel finally admitted it. He had moved the money into Harper Commercial as a temporary project deposit. Temporary, that word almost broke something inside me. You transferred my parents' money into your company without telling me. I was going to replace it before you noticed. Richard cut in and told him to stop talking. Daniel ignored him. The company had needed liquidity to secure the Northgate agreement. Richard promised the deposit would return within 30 days. It had not, because Northgate had delayed the next payment until Harper Commercial secured all required parcels, including mine. The circle was complete. My money had helped finance a deal designed to pressure me into selling my own property. Patricia stepped toward me. Megan, nobody was trying to steal from you. I looked at her. You moved my parents away from me at my wedding because my father knew what your son had done. She lowered her voice. We were trying to prevent a scene. No. You were trying to prevent the truth. Daniel asked me to come somewhere private. This time I agreed. Not because I wanted to protect him, because I needed answers before I made a decision I could not undo. We went into the small bridal room behind the ballroom. Dad came with me. So did Mom. Richard tried to enter. I shut the door. Daniel stood near the vanity where my bouquet had been left hours earlier. I removed my wedding ring and placed it beside the flowers. He stared at it. "Megan, please do not do this because of one terrible decision." One. I counted them for him. He had hidden the development deal. He had promised Richard he could obtain my land. He had moved $25,000 from my account. He had hidden the dispute with Dad. And that morning, he had helped keep my father away from me until after the reception. Daniel sat down. He looked smaller without Richard beside him. Then he finally told the truth. Not all at once, piece by piece. Harper Commercial was in trouble. Richard had expanded too quickly. 2 office projects had lost tenants. Interest costs had risen. A lender had refused to extend one of their loans. Northgate was supposed to fix everything. If the redevelopment closed, Harper Commercial would receive an acquisition fee large enough to stabilize the company. Daniel had believed he could convince me to sell, not force me, convince me. He planned to tell me the land had become valuable and present Northgate's offer as an opportunity for us to start our marriage with financial security. He had even calculated how much I might receive. That was the part that hurt most. He had rehearsed my choice before giving me one. I asked what would happen if I refused. Daniel looked down. Richard had signed a performance guarantee. Dad understood before I did. "How much?" Daniel answered quietly. $800,000. Mom covered her mouth. If Harper Commercial failed to secure the parcels by the deadline, Northgate could pursue the guarantee under certain conditions. That explained Richard, but Patricia still did not make sense. She did not work for the company. Why had she become so involved? Daniel rubbed both hands over his face. Because she guaranteed one of the company loans with her house. There it was. Everyone had something to lose. Richard could lose money, Patricia could lose her home. Daniel could lose his career. My parents could lose their dignity. And apparently, I was expected to surrender whatever was necessary to keep the Harper family standing. I asked Daniel why he had not simply told me the truth months ago. His answer was almost a whisper. "Because I knew you might say no." That sentence ended my marriage more completely than anything else. Not the money, not the land, not even the wedding table. He had hidden the truth because my consent was inconvenient. Dad asked whether I wanted to leave. I looked through the narrow window in the door. Guests were still sitting inside the ballroom. Some were checking phones. Others whispered across tables. I could have walked out through the service entrance. Part of me wanted to. Then I saw my parents' table again. 2 chairs beside swinging kitchen doors. That image stopped me. They had been treated like an obstacle because they protected me. I was not going to disappear and allow Patricia to explain the evening however she wanted. I picked up my ring. Daniel stood. For one hopeful second, he thought I was putting it back on. I closed my fingers around it instead. Then I returned to the ballroom. Patricia intercepted me. "Think carefully about what you say." I did. More carefully than she expected. I walked onto the stage and took the microphone. The room went quiet. I did not expose Daniel's company finances. I did not mention Patricia's house. I did not read private emails aloud. I had no interest in humiliating people for entertainment. I simply told our guests that an important family matter had come to light and that the reception would end early. Then I looked toward my parents. I said the seating arrangement they had been given was not the arrangement I approved. My voice shook once. I continued. I asked them to come forward. Dad hesitated. Mom took his hand. They walked through the ballroom together. I moved 2 chairs beside mine. Nobody stopped them. Then I said something Patricia clearly had not expected. My parents paid part of the cost of this wedding. They supported me throughout my life. They will not spend another minute sitting beside a kitchen because someone decided their place in my life was negotiable. A few people began clapping. I asked them to stop. This was not a victory speech. It was my wedding falling apart. Daniel stood near the dance floor staring at me. I told everyone dinner would still be served because the staff had worked hard and the food had already been prepared. Anyone who wished to stay could eat. But there would be no first dance, no speeches, no cake cutting. Then I handed the microphone to the bandleader. Patricia approached me immediately. "You have embarrassed this entire family." I looked at my mother. "No, your family embarrassed mine." Richard was already on his phone, probably calling an attorney. Good. I intended to call one too. Dad drove me home that night. Not to Daniel's apartment, to my parents' house. I slept in my childhood bedroom wearing one of Mom's old t-shirts because my wedding dress was still hanging downstairs. At 7 the next morning, Dad's attorney Marcus arrived. He reviewed the bank authorization first. My signature was there. That meant recovering the money would not be as simple as calling the bank and reporting theft. Daniel had obtained my signature through deception, but proving exactly what happened would require documents, emails, and possibly litigation. The property was easier. It remained mine. Nobody could sell it without me. Marcus told me not to communicate with Richard directly. Then he asked whether Daniel had access to any other accounts, documents, or electronic signatures. My stomach tightened. I opened my laptop. We spent almost 2 hours changing passwords and reviewing statements. Nothing else appeared missing. Then Marcus found something in my email archive. A message from an electronic signature service dated 4 months earlier. The document had expired unsigned. I had ignored it because I assumed it was spam. Marcus opened the attachment. It was a spousal consent and property acknowledgement form prepared by Harper Commercial's outside counsel. My name was already typed into it. So was the legal description of my land. Daniel had sent it to me once, 4 months before our wedding. I had never opened it. Marcus stared at the screen. Then he asked a question that changed the direction of everything. If you never sign this, why does Northgate believe Harper Commercial already has your cooperation? Dad slowly turned toward him. Marcus picked up his phone and called Northgate's attorney. He introduced himself and said he represented the owner of the final parcel. There was a long pause. Then Marcus asked them to send him the document they had on file. It arrived 11 minutes later. We opened it together. Same form, same property, same name. But this version had been completed. At the bottom was an electronic signature bearing my name, and according to the timestamp, it had been signed from an IP address, registered to Harper Commercial. Daniel had not merely assumed I would eventually agree. Someone had already told Northgate that I had. Marcus told me not to accuse anyone yet. A digital signature could be challenged. Accounts could be shared. Devices could be misidentified. We needed records. So I did something that surprised Daniel. I stopped arguing with him. When he called that afternoon, I answered. He apologized again. He blamed Richard for pushing the deal too far. He admitted moving my money, but insisted he had never intended for me to lose $1. Then I asked about the property consent. Silence, just long enough. Daniel said he knew nothing about a signed version. I asked him to send that statement to me in writing. He became careful immediately. Why? Because my attorney asked me to document everything. Another pause. Then he said we should solve this as husband and wife. I looked at the wedding dress still hanging from my mother's guest room door. You stopped treating me like your wife when you decided my no was a problem to work around. I ended the call. Marcus sent Northgate formal notice that I had never authorized the consent. He also demanded preservation of all emails, electronic signature records, and communications involving my property. Northgate responded quickly. They had too much money at risk to ignore it. By the next morning, their attorney confirmed the consent had been submitted through Richard's office. The audit record showed something even more important. The document had first been sent to my email. It expired. Then a second version was created using another email address containing my name. That address was not mine. Recovery information connected it to a phone number registered to Harper Commercial. Richard called Dad within an hour of receiving Marcus's letter. Dad put him on speaker. Richard offered to make everything disappear. The $25,000 would be returned immediately. Harper Commercial would withdraw its claim to my parcel. They would even pay my legal fees. All I had to do was sign a confidentiality agreement and confirm to Northgate that the consent issue had been an internal administrative error. Marcus shook his head before Richard finished. I said no. Richard's voice hardened. You are destroying a transaction that affects dozens of people because you're angry at your husband, I answered calmly. Your transaction depended on property you did not control. That is not my mistake. Then Patricia called. She cried this time, not dramatically. That almost made it harder. She told me she might lose the house where Daniel grew up. She said Richard had assured everyone the Northgate deal was safe. Then she said something I will never forget. You have the power to save all of us. I closed my eyes. Months earlier, that sentence might have worked. I had spent years confusing being needed with being responsible. But her house was not collateral because of me. Richard had made that decision. Daniel had made his. Patricia had supported them when protecting their choices. Required humiliating my parents. I told her I would not sign away my property to repair decisions I had never been allowed to participate in. Then I ended the call. The next week moved quickly. Northgate suspended the acquisition agreement and began its own review. Harper Commercial returned my $25,000 after Marcus sent a formal demand. Returning it did not erase what Daniel had done, but at least my parents' money was back where it belonged. Then the electronic signature provider released its audit information under Northgate's investigation. The false account had been accessed repeatedly from Richard's office, but Richard had not created it. Daniel had. Marcus showed me the login records in his office. I read them twice. Daniel had lied even after the wedding. That was the final piece. Not because it was the largest betrayal, because he had been given one last chance to tell me the truth after everything collapsed. He still chose himself. I filed for divorce. Daniel came to my parents' house that evening. Dad wanted to send him away. I went outside instead. Daniel stood beside his car, looking exhausted. He admitted creating the email account. He claimed Richard told him the consent was only needed to keep Northgate interested, while he convinced me properly. He said he never believed the document would actually be used to transfer my land. Maybe that was true. It no longer mattered. You signed my name. He looked down. I thought I could fix it before closing. That was always Daniel's answer. Later, afterward, before I noticed, before closing, before the wedding ended. He kept treating consequences like appointments he could reschedule. Then he asked whether I had ever loved him. That question hurt because I had. Deeply, I told him love was exactly why I had ignored so many warning signs. But loving someone did not require me to remain married to the person he had chosen to become. He cried. I did too. Then I went inside. The divorce took 5 months. There was no dramatic courtroom battle. My attorney documented the transferred money, the false electronic consent, and our financial records. Daniel eventually agreed to a settlement rather than fight. Northgate terminated its agreement with Harper Commercial. Richard lost the acquisition fee and faced a separate civil dispute with Northgate over representations his company had made during the transaction. He later sold one of his commercial properties to reduce the company's debt. Patricia did not lose her house. That surprised me. The threat had been real, but not immediate. Once Richard refinanced part of the remaining debt and sold another asset, her guarantee was released. For weeks she had spoken as though my signature was the only thing standing between her and homelessness. It was not. It was simply the easiest solution for them. My parents kept their warehouse. I kept my land. Several months later, Dad received another offer from a different developer. This time, he brought it to me openly. We sat at his kitchen table with Marcus and reviewed every page. The offer was good. Very good. I could have sold. I chose not to. Not because I wanted to punish anyone. I simply was not ready. For the first time, waiting felt like a decision rather than fear. My relationship with my parents changed too. I asked Dad why he had waited until the wedding to show me everything. He admitted he had made a mistake. He had wanted to protect me. He kept hoping Daniel would confess before the ceremony. Dad had even considered stopping the wedding that morning, but he was afraid I would believe he was trying to control my life. I told him I wished he had trusted me with the truth sooner. He apologized. No excuses. That mattered. Mom later admitted she had wanted to tell me immediately, but Dad convinced her to give Daniel one final opportunity. We could not undo that morning, but we could learn from it. Nearly a year after the wedding, I drove past the reception venue on my way to a client meeting. For a moment, I remembered everything. The flowers, the microphone, my father's brown envelope, and those 2 chairs beside the kitchen doors. For months, I thought that table represented the worst day of my life. Eventually, I understood it differently. It showed me exactly where people expected my parents to stay, quiet, grateful, out of sight. And it showed me where they expected me to stay too, smiling, agreeable, easy to manage. I do not live there anymore. I still have my wedding ring. It sits inside the brown envelope Dad carried that day. along with a copy of the false consent form and the seating card with my parents' names on it. I keep them for one reason, not anger, memory, because boundaries rarely arrive as one brave decision. Sometimes they begin when you finally look at something you have been trained to overlook and say no. That wedding was supposed to mark the beginning of my marriage. Instead, it marked the day I stopped allowing other people to decide what my love, my loyalty, and my silence were worth. I lost a husband, but I did not lose my family. I did not lose my property. And most importantly, I did not lose myself trying to save people who had been perfectly willing to sacrifice me. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe, because I share a brand new family story here every single day. And if you're not ready to leave yet, open the next story on your screen. I have a feeling it will stay with you just as long.